You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for July 23rd, 2021. This week, COVID messaging, coffee, statins, and Watchman problems. First up, COVID. Again, cases are rising in the U.S. and European Union. Areas of low vaccination are clearly doing worse. But the New England Journal of Medicine published a big study from British authors this week showing that the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccine have close to similar efficacy against the Delta variant compared with the Alpha variant. It remains to be seen whether this uptick in cases will cause the same percentage of hospitalizations that previous rises in cases caused. I hope that the millions of vaccinated folks will provide a ceiling on hospitalizations. The obvious challenge now is how to increase the percent of vulnerable adults who get vaccinated. And this is why trust in public health officials and their messaging was so critical. Harvard epidemiologist Dr. Michael Mina had some very nice comments in the New York Magazine. I'll link to that article, and it's an article about the New York Yankees positive test story. Dr. Mina really bemoaned the black and white binary messaging. Here he was talking about the limitations of the supersensitive PCR test versus antigen test. He called binary messaging immensely destructive. One of Mina's core beliefs in public health is that you absolutely need to bring the public along. You need to keep them informed. If you don't have the public buy-in for everything you're doing, you will never defeat a pandemic. He went on, throughout this pandemic, we've generally considered the public to be the problem. But this is public health. The public isn't the problem. That's on the virus. Instead, the public is the solution. Pause on that for a second. The public is the solution. He went on and said, by assuming that the public was unable to deal with nuance, we have done immeasurable damage. Now, doctors who care for patients with chronic conditions know this concept well, don't we? The first step in helping a patient is understanding that patient's preferences. You have to meet patients where they are. Of course, another pillar of the shared understanding of medicine is frank discussions of uncertainty and risks. And I see a perfect analogy between how a doctor uses the shared understanding of medicine with a patient and how a public health expert uses shared understanding with the public. One major lesson of this pandemic will be how to improve public health messaging so as to make the public part of the solution. And I agree with Dr. Mina. As it is in our clinics, nuance is crucial, as is humility, and absolute utter frankness about the uncertainties and risks. And of course, finally, avoiding foolish recommendations. For example, the notion of putting 3-year-olds in daycare in masks for safety. Foolish recommendations will shred trust. And trust is hard won, but it is easily lost. Next topic today is coffee. JAMA Internal Medicine has published yet another coffee study. Now, I've written previously, and I'll link to this, that the research enterprise would be better off with fewer observational studies of things like coffee and chocolate and blueberries, etc. For one, these nutritional observational studies are methodologically challenged because of recall bias. People have to self-report. Another problem is that coffee drinking, dark chocolate consumption, blueberries, they track with other behaviors, and it's hard to sort out causality out of a single exposure. Plus, I really had thought the story on coffee was well established. I mean, oodles of recent studies have shown no association with arrhythmia. But I learned from the introduction of the JAMA Internal Medicine paper that some professional guidelines still suggest avoiding caffeine to diminish the risk of arrhythmia. Now, who knew that guidelines were that slow moving? This particular study from the UCSF team led by Dr. Greg Marcus, the first author, Yoon Jung Kim, and sorry for any mispronunciation, this study was somewhat better than most, and it had a few notable twists that are worth comment. The authors used the UK Biobank, which includes about 500,000 participants in the UK who underwent exams and provided blood samples and then were followed over time. Coffee consumption here was the exposure of interest, and incident tachyarrhythmia, any arrhythmia, AFib, flutter, VT, even PACs and PVCs, that was the outcome measure. Of course, the authors adjust for confounders like race and ethnicity and education level, BMI, physical activity, etc. Now, one of the twists here was that the UK Biobank participants also gave DNA samples, and this allowed the authors to construct a caffeine metabolism polygenic score by combining 7 genome-wide significant gene variants. A higher genetic score represents slower caffeine metabolism. A higher genetic score represents slower caffeine metabolism. Now, to validate whether these single nucleotide variants or genetic markers of coffee consumption, they tested the hypothesis that genetic makeup tracked with self-reported coffee consumption. And indeed, the gene variants influence coffee consumption, with slower metabolizers reporting lower coffee intake. The genetic data allowed the researchers to do what's called a Mendelian randomization study. Mendelian randomization has been called Nature's RCT, or randomized controlled trial. Editorialists Zachary Goldberger and Rodney Hayward called it a quasi-experiment. Now, the biggest Mendelian randomization I know of are the LDL genotypes, in which having gene variants that associate with very low LDL confers a very low risk of heart disease compared with people without the gene variants. And here's how I understand the Mendelian randomization in this study. Now, the big problem with epidemiologic studies like this is that self-reported low or high coffee consumption may track with other important variables that are non-random, like exercise or diet. But the gene variants occur at random. And if slow metabolizers who drink less coffee because they get a bigger bang for their buck had a lower event rate, you might have a clue that caffeine was important in causing that effect. The key with Mendelian randomization is that having or not having the gene variants is naturally randomized. Okay, now to the two main results of this paper. First, over 4 years, and with adjustments for confounders, the authors found that coffee intake not only did not associate with an increase in any arrhythmia, but they also found that each additional cup of coffee was associated with a 3% lower risk of incident arrhythmia. The hazard ratio is 0.97, with confidence intervals super tight at 0.96 to 0.98. Second main finding is that in the Mendelian randomization portion, they found no significant association between the underlying genetic propensities of caffeine metabolism and risk of arrhythmia. So my comments. Taken alone, it is hard to draw conclusions from one observational study, but these findings add to the many contemporary studies that find no association between caffeine and arrhythmia. And the absence of relationship between genetic markers of caffeine metabolism bolsters the conclusions that caffeine is not proarrhythmic. Again, because the gene variants that affect coffee intake are distributed randomly. Now, I think the main comment, the most important comment, is to make a huge cautionary note on the finding that each additional coffee associated with a statistically significantly lowering of arrhythmia. We should not take this as evidence that coffee is antiarrhythmic. And the reason I say this is that the sample size was huge, the effect size tiny at only 3%, and only a small fraction of participants reported an arrhythmia. So this is a classic problem with statistical significance in large databases. Tiny effect sizes that are not clinically relevant can reach a statistical significance threshold. So in sum, I don't know that we needed another study that finds a lack of association between coffee and arrhythmia, but there you have it. We do. And this one is particularly methodologically strong. And this paper makes the podcast because A, it forced me to re-review Mendelian randomization, which is really cool. It bolsters tons of prior data on coffee, And C, by keeping coffee's lack of harm in the news, it helps convert more of the public and doctors to the notion that one of life's treasures ought not to be feared. That said, what I tell patients in the clinic bears repeating. While coffee doesn't associate with arrhythmia in populations, by all means, if a patient feels more palpitations after drinking caffeine, they face a simple choice. Drink the coffee and put up with the flutters, or stop the coffee. Such is a classic preference-sensitive decision. And a final note, the other reason that the non-connection between coffee and arrhythmia is important is to lessen distraction. And this is because people digest only a finite amount of advice. Time and effort spent on caffeine is time and effort not spent on more important things, say not eating potato chips or ice cream or focusing on taking your anticoagulant. Third topic is CTA and statin use. JACC Interventions has published an observational study done in Western Denmark that studied the association between statin use and either no coronary disease or non-obstructive disease in 33,000 patients who had coronary CTA scans for symptoms between the years 2008 and 2017. The first author, Christian Overhouse, along with many colleagues, made two comparison groups. About 20,000 patients who had no coronary disease, clean coronaries, and 13,000 who had non-obstructive disease, lesions less than 50%. They then used national registries in Denmark to determine statin use in cardiovascular events, median follow-up 3.5 years. The main findings were that the absolute risk of the combined endpoint of MI and death was directly associated with CAD burden on the scan. CAD burden was assessed with four groups of coronary artery calcium: 0, mild, which was 0 to 99, moderate, CAC 100 to 399, and severe, CAC greater than 400. Well, remember, all these patients had either no or non-obstructive disease. Also remember that when I tell you the results, they are in rates per 1,000 patient years. So event rates were 4 in 1,000 in the patients with no coronary disease, 7.8 per 1,000 in mild, 13 per 1,000 in moderate, and 32 per 1,000 in severe non-obstructive disease. That's not too surprising, but the second finding was, get this, statin therapy was associated with an adjusted hazard ratio for MI and death of 0.52 in no coronary disease, and then 0.44 in mild, 0.51 in moderate, and 0.52 in severe non-obstructive CAD. That's stunning, because a 50% reduction in MI death is way more than we see with the expected 25% risk reduction that is observed in clinical trials. Now, the authors tell us that in absolute terms, the risk reduction ranged from an NNT of about 90 in no coronary disease to an amazing 13 in those with severe but still non-obstructive disease. An important caveat, the authors did something really useful to sort out whether there was residual confounding. In other words, healthy patients took the statins and that is why they did better. The authors did a negative control, meaning they looked at statin use and pneumonia and cancer, which are two diseases that statins do not affect. So there should be no association. But there was an association in this study. Table S9 in the supplement, my friends always look in the supplement, showed that statin use associated with a 50% reduction in pneumonia in moderate non-obstructive CAD and a 36% reduction in cancer in those with no coronary artery disease. So that strongly suggests residual confounding because statins don't influence those diseases. Table S8 in the supplement showed another finding consistent with confounding. Here we observed that statin use associated with a 43% reduction in death in patients with no coronary disease. Now come on, even the most ardent statin proponent would not say that this drug slashes death 43% in people with clean coronaries. So, of course, there was residual confounding in this study. Now, another huge problem is that the authors don't tell us what the pooled cohort equation would have predicted in these patients. we know they give us the pre-CTA probability of CAD, and we know that that's higher in those with disease versus no disease. But what I wonder about is how much more the imaging finding adds to the basic clinical data. Consider that for the typical intermediate risk person, say with a 7.5% 10-year risk. If this imaging study is to be taken at face value, a scan might change your absolute event rate from 4 per thousand to 32 per thousand. How does that really help the average person? I mean, in a grid of 1,000 faces, the difference between 4 and 32 frowny faces looks terribly small. People committed to doing everything to prevent MI, they're not going to be sensitive to the risk reduction. They're just going to take a statin regardless. And for those on the fence, I don't really feel like a difference between 4 and 32 events per 1,000 is going to help sort out the really difficult decision of whether to take a pill for a lifetime, a pill that doesn't make them feel any better. So in sum, this paper makes the podcast because coronary CTA imaging is becoming increasingly popular for the exclusion of left main disease. At least that is how I'm using the scan. And I don't think papers like this, with its serious confounding, can be used to support statin decisions. And I am surprised this one got by the zero CAC peer reviewers. Zero CAC folks believe that no coronary disease, no coronary calcium, confers a risk so low that you can avoid statin therapy. But this paper reports a massive 50% reduction from statins in patients with no coronary disease. That observation defies all that we believe about statins and atherosclerosis. My friends, always be careful using observational studies to overturn medical practice that has been established by oodles of randomized controlled trials. It is old news that data from RCTs and statins show that these drugs reduce event rates by about 25%, and of course, 25% of a bigger baseline risk translates to a higher absolute risk reduction. Final topic today is appendage closure. Let's start with the acronym DRT. The acronym here belies the seriousness of the problem. DRT stands for device-related thrombus, and its translation is that a blood clot has formed in the arterial circulation in the left atrium on or near the foreign body that was implanted to prevent a blood clot from forming in the left atrium. Now, I know the neutral Martian is going to be completely confused, but let me help sort this out. Jack has published a study from researchers from Mayo Clinic, first author Trevor Sennard, that attempted to assess outcomes and predictors of DRT. And my colleague and frequent debater, Dr. Osama Wazni, co-wrote the editorial. The editorial's pretty darn good. Journalist Patrice Wendling has outstanding news coverage. Please read her piece. The Mayo-led group reached out to Watchman centers and asked them to send in cases of device-related thrombus, along with 2 cases at around the same time that did not have a DRT. This allowed the researchers to compare characteristics and attempt to put together predictors of those who had a clot and those that did not. They studied about 700 patients, 470 without DRT and 237 with DRT. And the study reported many important and sobering findings, but let's first talk about its limitations. As Dr. Wazni and his co-authors wrote in the editorial, this study cannot tell us the incidence of device-related thrombus because this wasn't a systematic collection of data. So we don't know the denominator of total implants. And we already know the outcomes of a clot in the left atrium. It's bad, terrible. It increases the risk of stroke by many-fold. This study found a 3.5-fold greater risk of stroke in patients who had DRT, and that's in line with prior studies. But there were 3 other notable findings. First, clots form on this foreign body late after implant. 39% occurred between 45 and 180 days, 16% between 6 and 12 months, and 1 in 5, 20% of DRT occurred after a year. This is a huge problem. After the device is placed, the practice is to use an anticoagulant, a warfarin or DOAC, short-term, and then, supposedly, as endothelialization occurs, Endothelialization is jargon for the body growing a natural coating over the device. We are supposed to be able to stop the anticoagulation and switch to an antiplatelet drug like baby aspirin. The whole darn point of this therapy is that its benefits are not so much in the reduction of stroke. No trial has shown lower ischemic strokes with the device, but it's the elimination of the need of burdensome anticoagulation. But if you have a device-related thrombus or clot in your heart, now you have to take anticoagulation. And a DRT requiring anticoagulation totally, utterly, 100% negates the benefits of having the thing in your heart in the first place. Remember, many of these patients are having the procedure because they supposedly could not take anticoagulants, and now they have to. Second finding, the regimen of drugs that block clotting, so-called antithrombotics, and that includes single antiplatelet therapy, dual antiplatelet therapy, and anticoagulants, did not associate with the risk of having a device-related thrombus. At the time of DRT, most patients were managed with either single antiplatelets or dual antiplatelets, but 16 of the 237, 7% of cases of DRT, were on oral anticoagulation at the time of diagnosis. So that's strange, because if you add the dual antiplatelet therapy and the oral anticoagulants, about 1 in 3 patients formed clot despite hefty amounts of antithrombotic drugs. To me, this perfectly explains why in the Watchman versus warfarin pivotal trials there were more ischemic strokes in the Watchman arm. The thing is a foreign body in the atrium. Now, third major finding, the authors attempt to find predictors of DRT. This would theoretically help guide anticoagulant decisions post-procedure. The biggest factor was a hypercoagulable state. The second most was post-procedural pericardial effusion. Of course, if you have blood in the pericardium, you have to hold the clot-blocking drugs. Chronic kidney disease and non-paroxysmal AFib were also predictors of DRT, and again, these are the types of patients who are receiving Watchman. I don't think we can make much of the predictors because of the non-systematic data collection and no randomization. Now, I want to end this post by telling you what the proponents will say about this sobering data. They will say, come on, Mandrola, you've been in cardiology long enough to know that devices iterate and get better. You watch, we will design a better device and this problem will improve. Yeah, maybe, likely not though in this case. Consider stents. Stents got a whole lot better than plain old balloon angioplasty back in the 1980s. And still, in patients with severe but stable coronary disease, there is clearly no reduction in MI or death with the best drug-eluting stents. That, of course, is because atherosclerosis is a systemic disease and stents treat local manifestations. Well, stroke too is a systemic disease, and left atrial appendage occlusion is a focal solution for a systemic disease. So I believe no matter the iteration, left atrial appendage occlusion is likely to fail, especially when it is done in older patients who have tons of competing risks of stroke and bleeding. Next week is HRS, and I'll be attending and presenting virtually. I hope the next few episodes of the podcast will have some interesting heart rhythm news to discuss. That's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. And friends, remember, if you like this podcast, please remember to take the time to give us a rating, write us a brief review. That helps others find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.